Today we are going to look at the three cantos in the eighth sphere of Dante's cosmos. We are beyond the planets, beyond all this so-called eighth sphere of the heaven of the fixed stars. Before we get to, which will be next time, the Empyrean, the heaven of light and fire. But now we are in the heaven of the fixed stars, and Dante discusses the three theological virtues. And the three theological virtues, unlike they're so called to distinguish them from the cardinal virtues that Christians share with the classical tradition, namely, the fortitude, prudence, etc., justice, etc. These are the virtues that deal with the understanding of the divine. They open up this horizon of speculations about the language of God, the way God speaks to us, theology in this sense, the way in which we speak about God, theology, the logos. In theology, there's the word logos, and the way God speaks to us. So it's the place in paradise where Dante will focus on the meaning of what I call, it's not my phrase, basic words. The words which are foundations of the way in which we come out to discover who we are. They're words that we use, the words that we may not even know exactly what they mean, and yet Dante will try to define them. They are, I repeat, faith, hope, and charity. The three virtues that Dante will, in this, using Paul's letter to the Hebrews, where he accounts or gives a definition, at least, of faith and hope, but they are words they are terms that always implicate each other. You cannot go on explaining faith without really talking about hope. You cannot go on talking about hope without explaining faith. And both of them are recapitulated and come together, gather within the question of, within the virtue of charity and the virtue of love, They are words that they are very mysterious in many ways, but they are degrees of understanding, all of them. The three examiners, because Dante will go through the equivalent of a university examination, a medieval bachelor's degree. That's the term comes to us from universities, medieval universities, the bachelor. Dante is a bachelor who presents himself to the teacher. The teacher is testing him, and he will give an answer according to textbooks. Authentic, where the authentic, the deposit of one's own beliefs, one's own hopes, and one's own charity are gathered. The three teachers are going to be three apostles who are who are known as Peter for faith, St. Peter for faith, and that makes sense because Peter himself, the name stands for the cornerstone on which the edifice of Christian belief is built. The second one is going to be, for the virtue of hope, is going to be James, known also as the Galician, because why him? It would seem to be less obvious than the other two, because he, of all the apostles, is the one whose death was recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, and so he lived in a certain expectation of a life to come. So he would seem to be the real figure of hopefulness, of some idea of some way of expecting a future, and the life of eternity. The virtue of charity instead is examined by John, the apostle, to distinguish him from the seer, the writer of the Apocalypse. So it's the three apostles, Peter, James, and John. Are there ways in which we could, I could give some summary ways of trying to understand some of these virtues. One thing that I would ask you to look through when you have time to go in detail of this text, it seems to me that all the three cantos deal or have as a kind of what I would call undertext. The subtext of them, something that running through, but sometimes even visible, but not all the time visible. It's the question of exile. Dante is retrieving the language of exile, the language, as if these virtues are clearly virtues that don't concern at all the blessed in heaven. They can only concern us here in time. The blessed in heaven certainly do not need a faith or hope, or they don't really need to know about what love may be. Either they have it or they wouldn't be there, right? So this is, but it's the language of exile is running through these three issues, just as the language of time. So the connection between time and exile probably needs not much explanation, much glossing. We are in time, we are fallen, and it's only in the language of the fall that it's possible to think about exile. The other element running through this is really the question of very visible, a little, especially in Canto 26, the actual question of language itself. You know, what is the language of God? What are the names of God? Dante asks that question. Are we talking about an entity with a name? And if so, you know the whole debate about the so-called tetragrammaton, the four letters that are supposedly the tetragrammaton that name God. That's what the word means, the four letters. Are they known, or is God just ineffable? Is there some is it some kind of reality we can never even hope to name, or are we going to be related and connected to this idea, this knowledge of God, by analogical discourse? These are positions, the mystical position that denies even our knowledge of the name of God, the analogical position put forth by Aquinas, for instance, that we really talk about God analogically, and all the qualities we attribute to God they're not real, but by what we may know in our own lives. So Dante asks this question about what is the language of God, what are the names of God, and how do we get to know God? So the first virtue then is the virtue of faith. There are many ways, literally, I call it a basic word, because it's really a basic word because it founds us. It's a stone. Peter asks for the foundation of all this poetic edifice of the divine comedy. I would like you to think about this, the actual. Let me get into the text. There is this actual apostrophe, or at the beginning of Canto 24, "O fellowship elect to the great supper of the blessed Lamb, who feeds you so that your desire is ever satisfied, since by God's grace this man has foretaste of that which falls from your table before death appoints his time. Give heed to his measureless craving, and bedew him with some drops. You drink always from the fountain whence it comes, that on which his mind is set." He wants to know about that. What I would like to stress is the presence of this actual metaphor of a banquet. It is as if Dante is, clearly we're dealing with two metaphors here. One, which is exilic, the manna in the desert, the falling of this dew on the exiles, the wanderers, the Jewish wanderers in the desert. And the other one is the eschatological banquet. But it is as if any debate about faith has to be placed within a communal context. This is not going to be the professional faith the way you may have it, let's say, in 1550, roughly. No, and I'm really alluding to as a contrast, just to make you understand the case, the great debate between two figures of the Renaissance, called Erasmus and Luther. They debated at length about the question of whether or not how a text written about a century earlier, around 1440, a text by Valla, a great humanist who wrote about the free will and the defense of the free will, on free will, it was unclear to them what Valla really meant. So they go on debating. A text is called On Free Will. Erasmus maintains that Valla really had defended the existence of free will, because it's free will, which is a gift of God. It's something that has been given to us, and therefore we really have to come to know God through the acknowledgement of his authority, but because the freedom that we are talking, that he's talking about, he thinks Valla is talking about, actually comes from him. And so by the free will, we come to know and come to choose also the existence of divinity. Luther had very radical ideas about the question of freedom. There was no such a thing, he would argue, as free will. And actually the world, the universe, is a universe of absolute faith. And faith is freedom, and it's given to us by freedom, because it releases us from all obligations. It frees us from all constraints. It just makes us understand that our own relationship to the Creator is without any other intermediary forces of the world. So it's a radical theological claim of freedom and faith together. It's very possible. Many people, just to give you to extend this argument, there are many poets and thinkers who go on changing his scenario and believe that, for instance, freedom is actually the source of not faith but faithlessness. That the idea of one's own faithlessness may come, a denial of God may come from the assertion of oneself and the assertion of one's own total freedom. But this is, I'm giving you this also to exemplify the nature of the debates and the force of the debates. Dante insists, so removes the question of faith from one of radical subjectivity or radical faith, aware that there may be some flip side to it, that faith and lack of faith really both depend. If you reduce them to subjectivity, one can go on sliding into one of the two options very easily. Dante focuses on, with this first image, on the question of the communal experience, the banquet. And that to me is part of the shared world. This eschatological banquet where they're all, the vision where at the end of time, but the allusion is also to the manna, where the various figures, the community comes together. And then Dante goes on really focusing on the individuality, on the private profession of faith. It's really about him. The interesting thing that I want to point out is that Beatrice's words to Peter, around lines 30, she goes on appealing to him to go on to examining, but she does so in a very peculiar way. Let me read this passage. And she, lines 32, O eternal light of the great soul with whom our Lord left the keys. This is very canonical. It's part of the hagiography, the account of the iconographic representation of Peter with the two keys, which he brought down all of this wondrous joy. Test this man on points light and grave, as thou seest good regarding the faith by which thou walkest on the sea. This is an allusion recorded in the Gospel of Peter walking out of an act of faith, walking on water. Because Jesus asks him and tells him so. The strange thing about this reference is that Peter did not want to walk on water. It is the moment of, let me call it the crisis of faith, the moment where Peter had no faith. And in fact, Jesus calls him, O man of little faith, why don't you walk? And then he, I guess, feeling that he's teetering on the brink of the abyss, you can imagine, really seesawing over the waves, finally does manage to go on. This is a poignant moment, because clearly Dante is emphasizing that there are degrees of faith, and that the so-called crisis of faith must not be seen as denials of faith. On the contrary, that somehow there is a sort of dialectical movement between a profession of faith and doubts about owning, and that's the owning this gift, having this gift of faith. So this is one of the strange moments, and it's in the light of this strange fluctuation between faith and an experience of not faith that I think that what happens later has to the way it has to be understood. And then whether he loves rightly and rightly hopes and believes. Here the language of the three theological virtues all come together. It's not hid from thee, since thou seest them, and so on. And then Dante uses both the language of the university academic life, as if this were really an academic test. We'll come back to this issue in a moment. Just as the bachelor, that's the Bachelor of Arts, the baccalaureatus, as we call it, arms himself. So there are two. There is the weapon of knowledge, the academic knowledge as a force, knowledge as a weapon. Just as the bachelor arms himself, he does not speak till the master, magister, submits the question for argument, not for settlement. In other words, these issues are issues that always need the open-endedness of argumentation, and not that of a settling of the point. I armed myself with all my reasons while she was speaking to be ready for such a questioning and for such a profession. Speak, good Christian, declare thyself. Now, this is a knowledge that makes him visible, declare thyself, but a knowledge that does not keep him hidden. It sort of brings him into existence, makes him visible to us. Where is faith? And that's the question that Peter asks. And the answer is, may the grace which grants it to me to make my confession to the chief centurion, I began, give me right utterance for my thoughts. And I went on, as the truthful pen. An allusion is to Paul, a questioning an authority, and the word authority, as you know, is that which is, what do we mean by authentic and authority? These are key words. The word is auctoritas. Means that comes, which is worthy of faith. The teacher is not necessarily worthy of faith. You can question the opinions of the teacher and reject the question of there's a distinction between the master and the author, the one or the authority. The one who is an author is one who is worthy of belief, worthy of faith. So he quotes Paul, so this is a canonical answer. It's the truthful pen of the dear brother Paul, wrote of it with thee, Father, put Rome on the good path. Faith is the substance, literally the foundation, that which lies under all things, the ground of all things, substance of things hoped for. So faith, if we want to understand faith, we ought to probably go and read about hope, things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. And this I take to be its quiddity. Quiddity, a medieval part of the medieval lexicon, meaning its constitutive essence, its specificity. Now, if you thought that in the Middle Ages they would go on talking about faith, the famous formulation of faith comes from Tertullian, who says, I believe because it is absurd. So that faith becomes the consequence of, the extension of, the absurdity of all things. And because the claim made on what one believes has in itself the idea of being beyond reason, absurd in that sense, being beyond reason. And that's one of the ways in which faith is defined. It really means that faith exceeds the realm of reason. It means that faith can never really quite be an object of knowledge. Dante does not pursue that line. He tries to make faith and reason coextensive. This is the sense of I got to qualify that term coextensive, and I will in a moment, because obviously they are not, but they belong together. This is the sense of the whole metaphorical pattern of the university context. That is to say, you can know something about belief. Knowledge and faith really belong together. They implicate each other. They are not the same thing, because if you really could know everything of what you believe, then there is no reason why you should believe. That which faith becomes a necessity only because it's a way of acknowledging limitations of what one knows. But linking knowledge and faith is not just simply a way of saying that reason can know some of the content of what one believes, that there is a reasonableness to what one believes. That's all true. To say that reason and faith go together, there are certain claims about the reasonableness of what one believes. But it really means, I think, at a deeper level, that faith itself is a mode of knowledge. That it is a mode of knowledge exactly the way you have the knowledge of philosophy, though its modalities are going to be different, because philosophy submits to the rules of the rationality. But faith opens your eyes, and it's a way of showing you something about the world that the reason alone cannot do. So the binding of the two metaphors, that's what I meant, coextensive, but not identical. I didn't mean it identical. The joining of philosophy and theology, reason and faith, makes and projects faith as a way of knowing. It makes you see the world in different ways if you were trying to look at the world in the light of natural reason and from the point of view of rationality. So this seems to be the argument, and I set the terms against, let's say, a modern subjective idea of freedom, faith as freedom that frees you from all, and you are only accountable to the Creator, or faith as a mode of responding to the absurdity around oneself, which is really the language of Tertullian, and then this scholastic argument that Aquinas of knowledge and faith really needing to be together. And then the examination goes on, and I want to talk about 70. Then here, thou thinkest right. This is the beginning of the top of the page, Canto 24, slide 68. Then I heard, thou thinkest rightly, if thou understandest well where he placed it among the substances, and after among the evidences. And then, and I then, the deep things which so richly manifest themselves to me here are so hidden from men's eyes below that their existence lies in belief alone. Now, it's a distinction, the caesura between belief and where we are, the evidence of things not seen. The paradox remains. So there are things visible here in the heaven of the fixed stars and not available to those of us who are in time and in the fallen world, on which is based the lofty hope, and therefore it takes the character of substance. And from this belief we must reason without seeing more. Therefore it holds the character of evidence. This is a gloss on the medieval theological lexicon that Dante has been deploying. Then I heard, if further is acquired below for doctrine, where thus understood, there would be no room left for sophist wit. And then this breathed from the kindled love, and it continued. I want you to pay attention to this metaphor. I wish we're really sitting around the table where I could ask you to speculate about the presence of the coming metaphor. If further is acquired below for doctrine, now the alloy and the weight of this money have been well examined, but tell me, if thou hast it in thy purse. All of a sudden, the question of money and the question of faith come together. Faith is literally given as it's said to be money. Do you have this coin in your purse. Therefore I have indeed so bright and round that of its mintage I am in no doubt. Then there came from the depth of the light that was shining there this precious jewel. That's one reason why the metaphor of money is used clearly for faith. It's a precious jewel on which every virtue rests. Whence did it come to thee? And the language is going to be, it's from the plenteous rain of the Holy Spirit and the new parchments and so on. But that metaphor of money as faith really sort of has a way of lingering on in our minds. What is the connection? One connection, I repeat, is to indicate the preciousness of the faith one holds. It is really as rare, maybe, and it's valuable as rare, beautiful jewels can be. That's one thing. But clearly there is more. Because the word money, which Dante uses in Italian, moneta, it's the same word, it becomes a character in an English epic. Moneta comes from the Latin form moneo. The word money, as you know, comes from, it's like meaning a warning. It's an advice, it's a warning about its mintage. It's part of the language of we have the word admonishment that comes from it. It admonishes that it's not a counterfeit, that it is really pure. Okay, so that's another way of referring to the purity of this faith, the preciousness before, now the purity of this faith, the authenticity of it, so to speak. Another trait of money is that money it's that which establishes the value. It circulates, first of all, has the power of circulating. That's not said by the text, but it's implied by the metaphor. It is as if faith has that power, is that virtue that puts everything into motion, and therefore questions and establishes. That's what makes it a basic word. It establishes, it's the substance that establishes the values of all the things that are around us. But fourth, I cannot really get past my mind that Dante wants us to think about this kind of the resonance of profanation that is in the language of money and link it with really this purity of faith. It is as if there is, the distinction is really never quite between profanation and the purity of faith, and that somehow the world of faith comes out of the world of profanation. That it belongs to the world of time, it can be profane, and yet it still manages to put things into circulation. You see, the ambiguity of money, the ambiguity of the metaphor of money, I think sheds a lot of light on this virtue that Dante has been examining. He's been examined about it, but is examining it for us. Let me go and see whether we can see more about this virtue by looking at the question of hope that comes immediately after with the examination by St. James. I begin to tell you here just a little story that, it's not an unusual story, but as you probably know, the Greeks never thought of hope as a virtue. There's a reference to hope in as being one of Pandora's, being one of the entities available in Pandora's box. You know about Pandora's box, which was opened, and all the evils of the world came out of Pandora's box, save for one, hope. It's a statement, it's a view that really casts hope as clearly some kind of evil or a delusion. And in fact, for the Greeks, the idea of hope is always a term that implies the delusion of exiles. it's really what befalls an exile, someone who loses one's land, and what is left for him to do? Nothing but hope. It's the radical illusion. It's a kind of hope against hope. I have nothing more to do. It's a self-deception. That's really what it is. Dante does not follow that route for hope. And in effect, I think that he finds in the Bible the idea that, or a kind of a different horizon, a kind for the rethinking the way in which hope can be viewed. Hope, first of all, is literally a virtue of time. More so, faith, with the language of the clock, you must have noticed in Canto 24, introducing the world of hope. I did not want to talk about it because I know that I'll be talking about it now. Hope is as much a faith, a virtue of time, because it's a virtue not only of time, it's a virtue specifically of the future. It tells me whenever, if I have hope, I can't really hope about the past. It would fly against all sense, against all logic. I hope yesterday didn't rain. Doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, but I can hope that tomorrow won't snow. I can have that hope, which would be a silly hope, but it's a hope nonetheless, because it's a virtue of time in the future. It's a way of experiencing time in the future. That's one thing that Dante is doing. Linking, therefore, hope and temporality. But it's not only a virtue of time, it's the most realistic of virtues. Normally we think, and the Greeks would sort of give us a cause to pause, that if you really hope, it's because you are really desperate. You hope because they have no rational reason, no realistic reason to believe that things are going to go the way you wish they went for you. So you go on hoping. Dante says, no, hope is the most realistic of virtues because it tells me that nothing is really ever over. That's what makes it realistic. The negation of hope, the opposite of hope would be despair. That Dante, you remember, is the sin for Dante, is the sin that we find in Canto. We never read it. And now, retrospectively, I can tell you that you should go and read it, Canto 8 of Inferno. And even in Canto 9, the encounter with the Medusa is that fear of despair, that idea of being petrified. The Medusa can turn you into a stone. That is to say that you are imprisoned and you remain caught either in your standpoint or in that particular reality that you have, or the idea of yourself as you like to, as you think you have been, in the idea of the past. Dante says, no, hope is a virtue of the future. It's a virtue that can even change the past. In that sense, it's effective on the past, though it's determined, because it tells us that the past may not be what we thought it was. You know, whatever disaster you may have had, whatever disappointment you may have had in the past, that disappointment may contain seeds that really will reappear in the future and maybe are preparing a future that will surprise you. So this is a different understanding of time that Dante presents. It's an understanding of time that once again Dante links with two moments of his, which is in that sense, it's really not different from faith. It fulfills faith. It unveils the element of faith. You cannot really go on hoping about something like that unless you have an act of faith. And Dante goes on explaining it in existential terms and tying it to his own hope of returning to his homeland, his own native city, and the larger pattern of exile. I want to examine that with you. The poem begins with a subjunctive. The Canto 25 begins with an optative, what we call, I wish, you know, oh, that things were going that way. If ever come to pass. Contingency, the word is contingency in Italian. It uses a Latinism, because we don't really use that in that sense. But well, I read it in Italian, even if Margaret, I wish she were here. Semi continga. That's a Latinism. If ever were to, if ever were contingent, if ever happened in that sense, that the sacred poem, che il poema sacro, if ever come to pass that the sacred poem, Dante uses sacred, and the sacred means, remember that Dante uses the word sacred always in a double sense. A sacred, he's not investing it with some kind of magic, idolatrous power, because for Dante the sacred is never reducible or localizable. That's a verb, localizable in one object or in one particular place. He means it ambiguously as that which contains the profane and the sacred within it. Hell and heaven, descriptions of heaven and hell. The sacred poem to which both heaven and earth have set their hands. It's an incredible moment of prophetic self-awareness. I am writing, but I know that without God, I would not be able to be writing this poem, that it has made me lean for many years. Writing now, I'm sorry that I'm giving you this kind of simple paraphrase of it, but the ascesis of writing. Writing as you understand what I mean? Writing as an ascetic labor of the soul. It makes me lean as if he were undergoing fasting. The rituals of the commitment to a particular labor. So I call it the ascetic labor of the soul, should overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair sheepfold. If I could ever go back home. But he called back home Florence in the Canto of Hope, where he's an exile, and the city is described in pastoral terms. The metaphor of the city as a sheepfold, the pastoral language, the language you expect to have in the eclogues of Virgil, the pastoral tradition, the idyllic world. That's what we mean, the pastoral tradition. Anyway, if there ever were some peace, some idyllic circumstances in that city, and you can continue, where I slept as a lamb. Here he continues with the pastoral language. An enemy to the wolves that make war on it, with another voice now, and other fleas, I shall return a poet, and at the font of my baptism take the laurel crown. For there I entered into the faith that makes soul known to God, and after, because of it, Peter does encircle my brow. So Dante still is in the circle of hope, in the heaven of hope, and yet now he's really thinking about the last ceremony of Peter on him, who blesses him 3 times. It is as if literally faith and hope are now converging. The two virtues come together. What is Dante saying though here in this proem at the beginning of this canto? He's casting his hometown, Florence, in the pastoral language as a sheepfold, and then he's alluding to a messianic time, when the peace were restored, when the factions, the wolves, the whelps, the pun of wolves and whelps, it's very clear. That's what etymologically the word whelps come from wolves, and the lambs will lie together. Almost a kind of impossible time, a messianic time, when finally peace will be restored. And he goes on adding that he would be acknowledged, that's part of his hope, he will be acknowledged, at that time he would be acknowledged as a poet on the fount of his baptism, which, as you know, it refers to the baptistry of St. John, where we do have records that he actually was christened. That's simple language, but you have to ask yourselves, why would Dante talk? Why would he use this particular metaphor? The baptism is clearly the place where a community is constituted, and the baptismal font has that value. Not only has that value, it's actually the same baptismal font that Dante had. You remember there had been a profanation of it in Canto, described in Canto 19 of Hell, where Dante says that he broke one of those wells there, one of those wells exactly, which we try to understand in figurative terms, since it would be inconceivable that Dante would be capable of breaking it, he says to him, to rescue someone who was dying. But what is a baptismal font? For those of you who have no inkling of what this is, it's what we call the sacramental the typological, if you really are more textual and historical about that sacrament, that ceremony, reenactment of Exodus. When a child is baptized, he is literally said, he's told actually, that he is once again reenacting the crossing of Exodus. And to me this is extraordinary, that Dante says that he would be now acknowledged and be given the laurel of the poet on the baptismal font. The question you have to ask yourselves is, no doubt, is Dante is asking, how does a poet come home? He imagines a triumph at the baptismal font. Is there a home? What is the homecoming of poets? That's the hope. A hope for a homecoming where everybody will be at peace and there will be a feast, a festive mood, and he is going to be welcomed back and he'll be hailed and acknowledged as a poet. A great fantasy of the winner's return. That's literally what he's saying. Yet he's using this language of the baptismal font, which is the language of Exodus. It is as if he were saying that the poet can only come home in order to tell his community that I have to get out again. That all of them will have to do exactly what's happening to him. That the exile that has been, with which he has been punished and which is befallen him is really the message that his poetry can only give to the community from which he has been exiled. He's convoking the whole community around the baptismal font, which is the figure of exile, to tell them this is really where we belong, in exile, in the language of a spiritual exile, a language in which clearly implies some kind of remaking of oneself, rethinking of oneself. So now with this in mind, Dante goes on seeing the Baron for whom below they visit Galicia, an allusion to Santiago, and then she herself will go on. And I want to, before we read the passage, I want to give you this, the compassionate one, line 50, the Beatrice's presentation of Dante to St. James, and that compassionate one who directed the feathers of my wings, the flight of the soul, the name of the family, Alighieri, to so high a flight anticipated my reply. The church militant, this is Beatrice, has not a child more full of hope, as is written in the sun that irradiates all a host. Therefore, is it granted him to come from Egypt to Jerusalem, that he may see it before his warfare is accomplished. The other 2 points about which thou didst ask, not for enlightenment for him to report how dear this virtue is to thee, I leave to himself, for they will not be hard for him, nor occasion for boasting. And then like a pupil, once again, taking this language of school, the school child. The main thing about this presentation by Beatrice is that Dante's journey is glossed through one figure that I have been telling you ever since we started this course, these classes in September, through the figure of Exodus. Dante's journey here is literally described as a journey from Egypt to Jerusalem, which is the master plot of the Hebrews' exile from the bondage to the story of freedom. And exile becomes really that of exile is the figure of the master figure of the poem. So Dante then therefore is linking now exile and hope. And I think I already have indicated to you that this idea of writing as writing in the mode of exile is also that it's not to be seen in a subjective way, only relating to him or to the precondition for his own poetry, but involves the whole of history. History has to be seen from the standpoint of exile. So there is there is at the top of page 366, line 69. Hope, I said again, is a sure expectation of future glory. This is the openness to time as futurity, and it springs from divine grace and precedent merit. The light comes to me from many stars, but he first distilled it in my heart, who was so sovereign singer of the sovereign Lord David, who to Dante is the greatest of poets. Now, so we move on from here now to the last virtue, of love. And it is, there is a progression: faith, hope, and charity. It is as if only you have to know these virtues before the beatific vision can even be possible to you. You have to understand what it is that they do to you and they produce in you. When we come to love, however, we would be looking for a definition of it, as at least in a formula, in a kind of a citational formula given and available in Canto 24 and 25. We would be looking for it in vain. There's no definition of love, and it's clear to me, it's clear to you, I take, that Dante really thinks that this is the word, the key word. Love is the key word that seems to escape all possible definitions, which we know around us in a variety of ways. We understand it, and yet we cannot quite confine it and define it. And that to define it would really literally be a way of reducing its impact and reducing its value. It's such a basic word that Dante says that the only word that is really left, he is imaginary etymologizing in this treatise on language that he writes, this treatise on the De Vulgare Eloquentia. He says that the word love is the only residual term from the past that means that language is a way of, like food. The banquet at the beginning of Canto 24 is a way of gathering us and bringing us together. So love and food. Food is given as a metaphor at the beginning. Now love that escapes any particular definition, and yet it's the culmination of all these theological virtues. What Dante does see, and he has, I really want to turn to this scene. At the end of Canto 26, Dante meets Adam. So it's the confrontation with the beginning, it's the confrontation with the arch-poet, because Adam is the one who names the world, and therefore brings it into existence. That's really what we mean by poetry. That's what we're expecting of poets to do. And this is the meeting, the encounter with him. Lines 90 and following, Dante addresses him. O fruit, though the word really is apple, or fruit that alone was brought forth ripe. What on earth does he mean? That's a strange way of addressing someone. O fruit that alone was brought forth ripe. There were a lot of theological debates as to ripeness is an element of grace, a description of grace for Dante. If you're not ripe, when you are ripe, when you have received, have been touched by grace. So the argument was Adam created in a natural state, or was he already created in a state of grace? How long was he in the earthly paradise before he fell? And if he was in a state of grace, why did he fall? If he was in a state of grace, why could he commit this the sin of transgression? Is it a transgression that he commits by eating of the fruit of the tree? So Dante implies that he was in a state of grace. Ripe, refers to him as ripeness. That's the idea of fruit that alone was brought forth right. O ancient father, of whom every bride is daughter and daughter-in-law. This is the very language that Dante will deploy in Paradiso 33 for the prayer to the Virgin and being the daughter of her son, the question of the divinity and humanity of Christ. As humbly as I may beseech thee to speak with me, thou seest my wish, and to hear thee sooner I do not tell it. Sometimes an animal, let me just skip a few lines and see the answer that Adam will give, line 115 and following. Know then, my son, that not the tasting of the tree in itself was the cause of so long exile. So even Adam, the fall, was in a state of exile from the garden, falling into the wilderness, where he had to transform the wilderness into a garden, so that the work would be the way in which he could regain that which he had lost, the garden. But solely the trespass beyond the mark. I'll come back to this. In the place from which the ladies and Virgil, in limbo, I longed for this assembly during 4,302 revolutions of the sun. He's clearly thinking about the harrowing of hell by Christ, so that added now years to the 4,000 he counts. And I saw it return to all the lights on its track 930 times while I lived on earth. The tongue I spoke was all extinct before Nimrod. We saw him as the founder, the giant. It's a residue of gigantomachy, the classical idea of the giants fighting the gods. Nimrod, who builds the Tower of Babel. So the debate between them hinges on language. Language is the key now. And retrospectively, we're really coming to understand the language of theology. The question of what are the properties of theological language, and what are the properties beyond that of all words. No, that's the argument. I spoke with Xxiv before Nimrod's race gave their mind to the unaccomplishable task, the building of the Tower of Babel that could not be finished, for no product whatever of reason, since human choice is renewed with the course of heaven, can last forever. It is a work of nature that men should speak. But whether in this way or that nature, or that, but whether in this way or that, nature then leaves you to follow your own pleasure. Before I descended to the anguish of hell, the supreme good, from whom comes the joy that sways me, was named I on earth. I in Italian. Not I in the sense of, the subject. I don't think that that's what Dante meant. And later he was called El. Dante's using two Hebrew words. Well, he takes them to be Hebrew words for the name of God. God was called I first, and then he was called El. In fact, this is one of my students suggested to me that if you read them backwards, they really spell out the word Eli, which would be a word that we would acknowledge maybe nowadays as being the word for an appeal to God. I, and he was called El. And that is fitting, for the usage of mortals is like a leaf on a branch, which goes on and another comes. On the mountain that rises highest from the sea, I lived, pure, then guilty from the first hour to that following the sixth, when the sun changes, quadrant. And that's the end of this encounter. Let me focus on this question of the language that Dante's really with encounter with Nimrod explicitly highlights. Adam changes, Dante through Adam is changing the account he had given in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, which is a story about the origin of words and language, and where he had claimed that Hebrew persists, the Adam's language, unchanged through history, because it was inconceivable, he adds there, that Jesus would be using a language other than the primal language and not the corrupt language of human beings. Now the story changes. Actually, Adam's language has suffered alterations already in the garden, where the names of God keep changing. This, I think, is the key. This is the whole question of theology then, the names of God, the way we speak about God. God was called E, and then he was called El. There is no proper name for God. We only have words or languages that keep changing according to our own historical circumstances. And Dante goes on changing his own paradigmatic account about the status of the sacred language. He says there is no such a thing as a persistent sacred language in history. What comes out is that language is the mark of our own distance from the divine, that we are, and the language that we use is a part of our own exilic circumstances and exilic predicament. And therefore all the language of theology that Dante has been describing is part of this exilic longing of human beings. This is the story from 24, 25, and 26. Dante uses theology and the examination of theology only to place us back on the world, on this world, where we go on hoping, believing, and loving, realizing that these are all mysterious terms, without which, however, that's another meaning of the word for the resonance of money, without which where we know faith as a form of trust, without which we cannot really be functioning together, where we have hope as the realization of faith, and where we have love as that which is we are always longing for, and somehow the meaning of which is mysteriously escaping us. These are, I think, the three fundamental issues that Dante is discussing. And let me take some questions.
I have a question for you. You passed over briefly this statement of Adam that his transgression was not in the act of tasting the tree, but in crossing a boundary. I wonder if you could unpack that a little more, because it seems to me it seems to me a bit of a controversial statement, first of all, because the command was, do not eat from the tree. So for Dante to say this, it seems like there's something very specific that he wants to get across in this idea of boundary. Maybe if you could elucidate that point a little further.
The question is a question that I really welcome, and I was hoping someone would ask. The question is that I did not really explain the Adam statement when he says that his sin was not in the tasting of the tree, but in the trespassing of the limit, let's say, the mark. And therefore, it seems that there is some issue of boundaries here. And would I care to reply, try to give a response to that? Yeah, I could give a response at a number of levels, first of all. I would remind you that this is Canto 26 of Paradise. And Canto 26 of Paradise is symmetrically connected with the other two cantos 26. The canto of Ulysses, who also trespasses the boundaries, who is a metaphysician of sorts, who is dealing with space, and who himself, there's really no where on earth he's really going. He doesn't know his destination. He's trying to go somewhere, but doesn't really know that. But they are connected, and then Canto 26 of Purgatory, dealing with love. In its perverted form of Winitelli, of the poets, right, and Caesar, etc. So that's one of the connections. Another connection is that these are three cantos where Dante is using foreign languages. There's a deliberate connection there. In the canto of 26 of Inferno, you may remember that Virgil goes out of the way to be the one who is the interlocutor of Ulysses, and supposedly they speak Greek. In Canto 26 of Purgatory, Dante uses the Provençal language of Arnaud Daniel, who Arnaud starts speaking in Provençal, and then now we are using, Dante's using the foreign language, Hebrew, the names of God. So that's one connection. So there are a lot of other of these connections. In the case of Adam, who makes that distinction, to come specifically to your point, who makes the distinction between the tasting of the fruit, and it was not that he tasted the fruit, but that he trespassed the mark. That seems to be, you're right, that was a very controversial subject, because indeed that was the command given to Adam: thou shalt not taste of the fruit of this tree. And Dante presents Adam, who instead goes out to do that. And it's clear that he thinks that the tasting of the tree was not his saying, that was not his sin. That's Dante's take on it. It's not the tasting of the tree that was the sin. The sin was that he abolished all boundaries. I read that, I'm restating it, changing slightly. So I'm giving a paraphrase of what has been, what seems to be the issue here. It's clear that Dante thinks that Adam's act of eating of the tree was good. And Adam's act of the eating of the tree was actually the discovery of a knowledge that managed to elevate him. And that was good. So in a sense, from this point of view, this is there seems to be a contrast between Ulysses' form of knowledge and Adam's form of knowledge. Ulysses' form of knowledge is that he literally doesn't even know where he is going. That's part of the problem in purely metaphysical terms. You know, he had no directions. It was a gratuitous quest. In the case of Adam, getting to know of the fruit of the tree was not an issue. In fact, Dante says that maybe real knowledge is always going to be tied to an act of making discoveries and making even transgressions. What was the problem is that there had been a loss of boundaries, that he lost. How are we to understand the loss of boundaries? It was the kind of knowledge that made Adam realize that he could be divine. That was his problem. As soon as the imposition of the boundary, God's imposition of or establishment of the boundary between the human and the divine, was also a way of letting Adam know. I'm not going to read this as if it were a kind of atheistical statement at all. It's letting Adam know that he had to be aware that he was not a divine, that he was a human being. What Adam wanted to do was grow in knowledge and discover that he could also be divine. Do you understand what I'm saying? That is the issue. For him to fall then would be a way of reestablishing that boundary and realize that he is a human being and not divine. So it's a growth. It's a growth in self-knowledge. Well, if you really know that if you really know who you are, you have grown. Do you see what I'm saying? Dante is changing the sense of what the fall of man is. And the fall of man is not the fall in the growth of knowledge, but that growth of knowledge that leads you to erasing the boundary, to believe that you are, by virtue of that knowledge that you have gained, that you are now divine. And this is really what the whole poem is trying to convey to us, is that this is a steady temptation that human beings seem to have, and we need to be reminded. And when we hear it from God himself, we don't quite believe it. And then we have to grow into that recognition of boundaries between ourselves and something that we aspire to, but we are not it yet, okay? Good question. But I had anticipated this answer, I must say, in a number of ways, talking about Adam in the past. I hope that you don't remember, because more or less I said the same thing that I don't know that I mentioned before. And one might wonder, just to go back to that issue, one might wonder, does Dante really make it clear that he's really not Adam, but he still thinks that he is Ulysses at this point? One thing that he understands, that he is, in the canto before, he acknowledges King David as the supreme, and he did earlier, the supreme poet. He's really placing himself in David's Psalms are the lyrical recapitulations of engrossing of Exodus. That's really where he now, I think, he's trying to move, that he's more, he cannot be like Ulysses. He knows he does not want to be, he cannot be Adam. That's the kind of model he's trying to regain for himself. Okay, maybe you see the connection with what we said a little earlier, with what the response I gave to your question. Yes.
I think it's going off of Dante's theological beliefs. In Canto 24, he talks about his belief in the Trinity.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could just explain that further, because he seems to be saying both that the Trinity are three separate entities and a unity. And I know there was controversy and different factions of different factions in Christianity believe different things about the Trinity. And so I was wondering what Dante believed.
Well, Dante has a number of references throughout Paradise to the Trinity. One of them, actually a very significant one that we never talked about, was in Canto 25 of Purgatory, where Dante thinks that the way we human beings can understand it, one of the ways which we understand the Trinity is to think about the structure of our mind, memory, intelligence, and will. There are three, but part of one thing, and three functions. Or in Canto 24 of Purgatorio that Professor Lumers, I'm sure, explained to you, is that if you want to understand, Dante there seems to imply when he talks about I am one, when he declares his own poetic practice, I'm one who when love dictates inside me, go on using my language and so on. One way in which the Trinity was explained, they would say, think about speaking, to make it existentially compelling and concrete. When you speak, you have an idea in your mind. Otherwise, it's babble. You have an idea in your mind. You emit a sound, but to emit the sound, you need the breath. And you cannot have the sound without the breath, and you cannot have the sound without the idea. So that speaking encompasses this threefold components of one. The Trinity is always connected to one. Then in Canto 10 of Paradise, you remember we spent some time there having this idea of the love of the Father and the Son, and the breath of love that joins them, they go on gazing together, this idea of the fecundity, or this idea of the Trinity as source, or Dante who thinks about God in the form of the mover, but he does go into that, and yet he understands that that's not the effective theology he wants, to think of God as the prime mover, to think as the efficient cause. It makes God as such a mechanic or a clockmaker or something, one of these images of God who imparts order and recedes from creation. That's really not Dante's idea. He wants to think of a divinity that is partaking of creation's love. Dante's idea of the Trinity, so he has many, he tests all of these paradigms. I don't think that he ever excludes one. he does not really agree with the reading of Joachim of Flora, who thought that the Trinity was the unity of the Trinity could be dissolved into three separate beings. So that's no longer a unity. To have a unity, you got to have all three clearly present. That's what Dante believes. A unity with a kind of, is it a prismatic unity? Let me call it that way. And so that Dante would say, we all have some recognition of the Trinity, whether it's you know, God and the Word of God being the Quran from eternally, or God and the Word of God being the Christ, or etc. We all have the Word made flesh. We all have some kind of idea of the Trinity, where one acknowledges God as a Father or as a Spirit, ways in which we can understand this thing we call, I don't mean irreverently, we call God. So that's the response to what you're asking. Please.
From what you said in answer to the other question, it seems like you were saying that Dante thinks the fall is good in a sense because it leads to more self-knowledge, right? Dante thinks the fall is good in some sense because it leads to more self-knowledge. And I understand how it's different from Adam is different from Ulysses in that he is trying to go somewhere, like he's trying to become more like God. And that's good because it's a definite end. But it still seems that if the means of trying to achieve that end is wrong, like if he's trying to become more like God by like grasping instead of, like we've been talking a lot about how the way up is actually the way down, and that's so essential. And if he's choosing the wrong way to get to his end, if that changes the end itself so that he's not even really, you know, Adam's not even like having the proper end in his search for knowledge either. You know, like it changes because he's going about it in the wrong way. And just how that kind of reflects on whether whether Dante thinks the fall itself is like good as actually leading to self-knowledge. If that's at all clear.
Now it's very clear. The question is, the earlier question, of course, was about what Dante thinks of the Trinity. And now the question is, going back to the point of Adam and my suggestion that the fall is good. And though because ultimately Adam seems to be really wanting to reach God, and I made a contrast to Ulysses, and the limitation of Ulysses' quest is that he really does not know. He's driven by curiosity. That's what I meant, which we would talk about, this evil curiosity. But if the movement toward the good is bad, because after all, Adam does choose to trespass the boundaries, why should that really be thought as good? That was the question, really, yeah. Well, let me just restate this issue. The problem with first of all, with Ulysses, I called it now the curiosity, which, as you know, eventually will become good in the Renaissance. Scientific curiosity. That's the good thing. In fact, I have a young colleague who is writing a thesis about curiosity, a book about curiosity. She has written a thesis about curiosity, linking it with women's curiosity. It's a very interesting thesis to say that women are really smarter than men because they have been attacked for being curious. So she has found Renaissance texts were some written by women who go on making that kind of claim. I think it's a great idea. But how did Dante understand curiosity? How do the fathers of the church understand curiosity? Why is it bad? Because that is the trait of Adam. Because curiosity has a particular quality about it. It's something that continues, this whole understanding, this little curiosity I'm going to give you, well into the 18th century. The curiosity is bad because it uses up. You know, curiosity has a sort of restlessness within it. I am curious of a particular object, I observe it, and I move on to something else. I literally consume, I use up a particular object and devalue it in that process. That's really what made it so bad. Ulysses, who goes from one thing to another and is always open, fascinating figure of the Renaissance spirit of discovery. Then, but that's really what undoes this element almost of desire, a kind of a figure of, and I don't want to make, I'm not using this to badmouth Ulysses, but a figure of this way of thinking of the curiosity of Ulysses is really the Don Juan, no? Who goes from one woman to another in an endless movement of curiosity, knowledge, that he's driven by knowledge to get to know certain particular situations and people. Adam, to go back to the question of Adam, I'm only giving you Dante's reading. Dante's reading, he distinguishes very carefully between the tasting of the fruit and the trespassing of the mark. The trespassing of the mark meant you cannot really violate the boundaries that I want to place between you and myself. Because once you get to know yourself for what you are, you may get to know me. That's what the part of the violation of boundaries. You may get to know me for what I am. So it's a wall that protects both the essence of the divinity and the specific quality of the human that is at stake. Adam eats, which means that he wants to grow in knowledge. And Dante says, that's not the issue. That was not a problem, that I want to grow in knowledge. The consequence of that growth in knowledge was the trespassing, actually may have very well been the cause, the trespassing of the boundary. Had he really grown, that's really an acceptable aim. You have to grow in knowledge. I'm willing to say about Adam exactly the things that you may recall I said about the sin of pride when we discussed Canto 10, 11, and 12. It's good that you have this love of excellence and love of the growth of your own mind. The consequence of it, or the flip side of this quest for more knowledge, is the violation of boundaries, and that has to be reestablished. The fall of man is only a reestablishment of the boundaries. It's not a way of mortifying the quest for knowledge. Okay? I'm restating what in different terms, slightly different terms, what I said before, but I think that's really a crucial distinction. And I would ask you to try to think that I see a difference between the two situations. I hope you will too. I have time for another. No, we don't. Okay. See you next time.